Chapter 1. Books. "What are you doing?" asked the thoroughly perplexed eunuch Jinshi, who looked as gorgeous as he always did. His attendant Gaoxuan stood behind him. "I should think that would be obvious," Mao said, wiping away sweat as she stood over a burning cook stove. Beside her was the quack doctor, fanning himself with his hand and obviously finding the heat rather unpleasant. While he worked assiduously, Mao needed an assistant, what with her legs still healing. She couldn't help thinking his movements were as flabby as he was. Maybe she was hoping for too much. They were using the cook stove in the medical office to heat a very unusual stew pot. From the lid of the pot emerged a long tube that ran through some cool water, causing droplets to form at the end, where they were then collected in a small vessel. This distilling device was one of the discoveries of their recent cleaning spree. It pained Mao to know that such a valuable object had sat unused in a storage room for so long. The air was full of the smell of flowers. A bevy of petals occupied the pot. "We're making perfume," Mao said. She had a wonderful source of petals in the roses she had cultivated for the garden party not long before. "It's certainly aromatic." "The smell is fairly mild compared to wild roses, and we'll thin it out further with oil and water." Over the generations, humans had fashioned roses to their liking, favoring beauty and richness of color at the expense of smell. That was simply the way of the world. You couldn't ask for everything, or you would get nothing. Jinshi peered at the distiller interestedly. When the doctor, who had been industriously transporting firewood, realized the other man was there, he started brushing the dust and dirt off his clothes with all the self-consciousness of an adolescent girl. Smoothing his mustache and beard with his fingers, he asked, "To what do we owe the honor, sir?" Jinshi's face darkened. Mao didn't think the doctor meant anything by his question, but Jinshi seemed to resent the way it had been asked. "No one could fail to notice a smell this strong," he replied, his lips forming into a slight pout. Nearby, Gaoxuan's brow furrowed. "He thinks Jinshi needs more gravitas," Mao guessed. The quack doctor was oblivious enough that it didn't much matter, but being important meant never looking less than distinguished. Mao got up from her chair, took some tea snacks from the shelf — she was well aware by now that the quack kept his most valuable treats on the highest one — and put them on the table. Jinshi sat down. Mao picked up a mooncake, took a bite for good measure to show that it wasn't dangerous, and then passed them to him. "I suppose you're doing this here because it would be more difficult at the Jade Pavilion?" Jinshi asked. "Yes, that's part of it." Mao wiped the grease off her fingers and resumed her place by the cook stove. She changed the vessel at the end of the tube for a different one. After a moment, a greasy substance began to fill it. Perfume oil. "The other part is this. Perfume oil contains an ingredient that can potentially abort a pregnancy. As long as a woman doesn't drink a concentrated dose of the stuff, she should be fine, but still." She glanced around, making sure the quack wasn't too close. He was a very friendly person, but he had loose lips. It was too soon to let him know that the mistress of the Jade Pavilion, Consort Gyokyo, was pregnant. In other words, there's no special need to regulate the perfume oil being used in the rear palace. Is that what you're saying? "Yes, sir. I think it should be all right." Making rules about every little detail would only make their lives harder. Besides, enforcement would be difficult in such a large place. Jinshi looked at the other pot on the stove. It didn't have a pleasant fragrance like this one full of rose petals. Instead, breathing whatever was in this pot made his head spin. "What's this one?" he asked. "That's alcohol," Mao said. Through repeated distillation, it was possible to achieve a very high concentration of alcohol. Indeed, this stuff was strong enough to make Jinshi feel drunk just by taking a sniff. It wasn't for drinking, but would be used for sterilization. The warm season was coming, when bad air could accumulate and cause physical harm. With a little princess at the Jade Pavilion, they would want everything to be as clean as possible. Mao was even making a bit more than she needed so she could leave a supply here at the medical office, where it would see plenty of use. "You can use it to clean things?" Jinshi asked. "Yes, I hear that's what they do in the West." This was one of the little factoids she'd gleaned from hearing about her adoptive father's experiences studying in the Western lands. If there was anything at all that set her apart, Mao thought, it was the knowledge she'd gotten from him. "As I recall, the man who adopted you was—" Before Jinshi could finish, though, they heard a great thump. Gaoxuan poked his head outside to see what it was. 2 eunuchs had arrived at the medical office with a massive box and had set it down just outside the door. "What's this about?" Gaoxuan inquired of the doctor. "Ah, the young lady requested it." Mao glared at the quack to shut him up, but she was too late. Jinshi had already taken an interest in the delivery, beginning to unpack it. She wished he wouldn't touch it without asking. "Master Jinshi, the tea is ready. Please have a seat and enjoy it, she said. What's this? He asked. Just something from my home. Nothing of interest, I can assure you. Unfortunately, Jinchi looked very intrigued indeed. I can't believe this guy, Mau thought. She, yes, even she, was a woman. She wished she would have the decency not to look at a moment like this. But instead, she cast her eyes to the ground and said, It's full of underwear, sir. Jinchi promptly took his hand away, looking unsettled. That's right, just leave it alone, Mau thought at him without looking up. But reality is rarely so accommodating. Just how much underwear is in there that it took 2 grown men to carry it? Gashwin asked. Leave it to him to notice the most inconvenient details. You're right, Jinchi exclaimed, and thus the contents of Mama's delivery, which she would have been just as happy for him to remain oblivious to, were unveiled for all to see. Fastidiousness. That's the problem with the rear palace, Mau said, her back straight and her face utterly serious. The ladies who comprised the residents of the rear palace were a collection of innocent virgins who hoped they might one day become the emperor's bedmates. Admittedly, not everyone was like that, but such exceptions were a minority. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that His Majesty's imperial eye fell upon one of the virgins. Not only would she have the intimidation of being with the emperor himself, she would be embarking upon completely unknown experiences with him. Imagine the consternation of the young woman who commits some novice blunder under those circumstances. I would argue they need to learn the basics ahead of time. And that's why you've acquired all this? Jinchi was standing imperiously in front of Mau, who sat in a formal posture on the ground. The situation felt oddly familiar. The delivery sat open, a great deal of literature visible inside. What kind of literature? Well, you know. The kind Mau had already been acquiring in some quantity to comfort a lonely emperor when he found himself pining away at night. Consort Liwa was likewise an avid reader of such material. This time, Mau had decided to get more than usual, in hopes of finding new sales opportunities here and there, but the timing of their arrival had been truly terrible. She'd had this batch delivered to the medical office so she could finally escape the gaze of the persnickety Hongyang, but look what it had gotten her. Mau was by no means avaricious, but if she didn't manage to earn a modicum of money, her old man back in the pleasure district might not have enough to eat. He was such a soft touch, her old man. She was sure the madam would badger him into working non-stop. Jinchi was openly exasperated, but he also seemed to sense the truth of what Mau was saying. When she added that this request came in part from His Majesty himself, Jinchi looked deeply conflicted, but recognized she was in the right. Gaoxuan, meanwhile, was flipping through one of the books with a studious expression. The entire scene was so surreal that Mau found herself scowling at it in spite of herself. This is exceptionally beautifully made, Gaoxuan commented. He's admiring the craftsmanship? Mau thought. She'd been entertaining the possibility that Gaoxuan was the world's most poker-faced lecher, but apparently that wasn't what had attracted his interest. They use fine paper, she said. Books about the bedchamber were hot sellers. They were often sent with young women when they went to wife, and those who read such checks for personal interest were more than willing to spend the money on them. Such books typically consisted mostly of illustrations, so one didn't have to be literate to enjoy them, and as much as they cost, the potential profits they might engender could be equally great. Are these printed? Jinchi was likewise studying the illustrations, but considering what they were illustrations of, the moment was plainly comical. The quack doctor stole embarrassed little glances here and there. Not with wood blocks, but with metal plates, I'm given to understand. That's really something. It was a Western technique. Mau didn't know much about how the books were made, but for Jinchi to say something admiring about them, they must be quite unusual. Since I finally got my hands on some high-quality materials, I thought it might be best to disseminate them more widely, Mau said. That's a different issue, Jinchi shot back. He continued to flip through the book, though, taking careful note of its contents. Mau, not sure she wanted him looking too closely, inadvertently slipped back into her skeptical gaze. Perhaps Gaoxuan noticed, for he nudged Jinchi gently. If it's caught your interest, sir, why not keep one for yourself? Mau said. No, it hasn't caught my anything, Jinchi said, all but throwing the book down. Mau picked it up and smoothed it out to make sure the pages wouldn't crease. No, indeed, Jinchi said, more confidently this time. But perhaps I can look the other way on this one occasion. He suddenly sounded rather self-important, but then he was important, so maybe that was inevitable. Are you certain, sir? Mau asked, a gleam beginning to enter her eyes. Yes, but I wish for you to inform me what shop is selling such things. Mao Mao's expression promptly changed to one of barely concealed amusement. Gaoxuan nudged Jinshi again. What? I just want to know more about this exquisite printing, he said, sounding slightly flustered. This conversation was getting stranger by the minute. Certainly, Mao Mao said, still looking amused but jotting down the name of the shop in a notebook. It's the truth. Of course, sir. She didn't think Jinshi had to resort to illustrations. Someone like him could surely see as much of the real thing as he wished. It wasn't possible that paper was sometimes preferable to reality, was it? Mao Mao, her thoughts threatening to run away with her, pondered the possibilities as she tore out the page of the notebook and gave it to him. As she did so, she couldn't help noticing the excellent quality of paper in the doctor's notebook, just what one might expect. Joking aside, Mao Mao suspected Jinshi might have it in mind to start up a new business venture. The real trick of politics was figuring out how to extract taxes from the populace without unduly upsetting them. One way was to increase people's income, and the first step in doing so was to invest tax money. Don't know exactly how he plans to go about it, Mao Mao thought, but the important thing to do now was to pick up the scattered books. Jinshi was attracting his customary audience, and while it might have been interesting to discover just how they would look at the gorgeous eunuch if they knew what kind of reading material he was perusing, Mao Mao wasn't a terrible enough person to give him away. While Mao Mao was busy cleaning up, Gaoxuan's hand brushed the box in which the delivery had arrived. What's wrong? Mao Mao asked. Gaoxuan looked hesitant. I was wondering whether any of them might require censorship. He was talking, of course, about the content of the materials. Several were rather, well, hardcore. His Majesty's personal preference. And what a preference it was. I'm told that our most important reader found something lacking in the earlier material. Absolutely not, Gaoxuan said. And after she'd wheedled the madam into handpicking the best stuff, she reluctantly handed him the most lurid of the material. Some 10 days or so later, Mao Mao was loafing around the laundry area. I wonder what's buried down there, Xiaolan said innocently, leaning against a wall with a laundry basket in her arms. The weather was excellent today, so the laundry area was bustling. Eunuchs washed clothes as fast as water could be brought. The maids' uniforms were laundered by being trodden underfoot in a harsh lye mixture, while the consort's clothing was worked by hand using a handmade soap. Search me, Mao Mao said. She pulled out a big treat wrapped in the skin of a bamboo shoot and handed it to Xiaolan, who took it with a grin. The question about what was buried down there was, Mao Mao gathered, a line from a novel. Novels were all the rage in the rear palace these days. What do I seek beneath the bewitching blossoms? Xiaolan inquired, her eyes sparkling. She was a country girl and couldn't read. There must have been someone reading the story to her. I wonder what it could be, she said around a mouthful of food. Her cheeks bulged like a squirrel's. Maybe horse crap, Mao Mao ventured, earning a snort from Xiaolan. The girl managed not to choke, but she glowered at Mao Mao, her eyes watering. Mao Mao brought some water from the water supply and helped Xiaolan drink it, rubbing her back. You shouldn't eat so fast. It was your fault. What Mao Mao had said wasn't untrue, though. Growing good vegetables required more than just water. Feeble soil would bring forth feeble produce. That's what fertilizer was for. Beautiful flowers were just the same. The more beautiful they were, the more potent the fertilizer must have been. But a young girl smitten with a romantic story probably didn't want to have her attention drawn to such vulgar details. Mao Mao resolved to be more careful in the future. It wasn't long before their turn came to do their laundry. The novels Xiaolan was so taken with were making the rounds of the rear palace, and the Jade Pavilion was no exception. When Mao Mao got back, in fact, she discovered 3 young women chatting and giggling over a rough-hewn book. Hi, Mao Mao, said the calm, mild-mannered Gui Yuan. The other 2, Yinghua and Ailan, were too absorbed in the book to greet her. Gui Yuan had the page between her fingers, and the women were tugging on her sleeve, urging her to hurry up and turn it. Mao Mao leaned down to look at the cover, which had an illustration of a tree with a profusion of blossoms and a figure standing beneath it. She surmised it was the same book Xiaolan had been talking about. You want to read it later, Mao Mao? Gui Yuan seemed to be a quick reader, quicker than the other 2, and she had time for a little conversation. No thanks. Why is everyone so excited about that book, anyway? Mao Mao asked. It came from His Majesty. It's great, believe it or not. His Majesty. So it had come from the Emperor himself. The surprising thing was that he knew about it at all. High society tended to look down on novels as not refined enough. They held that fact was more edifying than fiction. Apparently, he gave them to all the consorts and told them to share them around when they were done reading them, Gui Yuan said, although she looked a tad disappointed that Consort Gyokyo wasn't the only one to receive this special gift. Well, well, Mama said, looking more closely at the cover. She realized she recognized the mark on it. It was the seal belonging to the bookstore she'd referred Jinchi to the other day. Ah, now it makes sense. She finally grasped why he had been so interested in her reference materials. When Jinchi had seen the quality of the paper, he had realized it would be suitable for a gift from the emperor. If the books had really been given to all the consorts, that meant at least 100 had been printed. If they could make plates of the books, even more could be produced. Then, if they produced a popular edition on slightly less expensive paper, they could realize even more profit. Mama was starting to think she should have asked the printer for an intermediary's fee. She was sure Jinchi must have planted the idea in the emperor's head. I should have known he was planning something. Fiction novels, easy to approach but unsophisticated, were being distributed to the consorts. Normally, any gift from His Majesty would be cherished and treasured, but by giving books to all his ladies, each one would be less valuable. And anyway, the gift was nothing but pulp fiction. There would probably be a few disobedient consorts scandalized by the idea of even touching the thing. On top of all this, there was the command to share the books with other people. Some of the consorts might hit on the idea of having their ladies-in-waiting read the book to them, instead of taking the trouble to read it themselves. The pieces were starting to come together. Mama began to see what Jinchi was up to. The ladies-in-waiting who learned the story would share it with other women, hence why even Xiaolon could quote from the book. Aw, are we done already? Yinghua asked, looking as dejected as a dog who'd been denied a treat. The book was now closed, and Guiyuan and Ailon wore similar expressions. More! I want to read more! Yinghua exclaimed with all the fervor of a deprived child. Amusements were few and far between in the rear palace, so even a lone novel was the source of genuine excitement. According to Master Gaoxuan, there's a new book being printed. When it's ready, he says we'll get a copy, Guiyuan says. Yeah, I know, but I can't wait that long. Guiyuan frowned at Yinghua. Yinghua, for her part, had her cheeks puffed out like a blowfish. Ailon, meanwhile, had the book in her hands and was looking at it intently. Is everything all right? Mamo asked. About this book, Ailon started. Hongyang, the chief lady-in-waiting, was looking after Princess Lingli while the other 3 ladies took their break. When their break time was over, they would switch, and Hongyang would have a chance to relax. We're the only ladies-in-waiting here, right? And Lady Gyokyo was nice enough to say we could read this. Doesn't it feel like kind of a waste if we're the only ones who get to enjoy it? Mamo thought she understood what Ailon was getting at. When you find something interesting, you want to share it. That's human nature. Mamo, for example, had once discovered a very rare snake she'd never seen before, and had gone around showing it to everyone she could find. They had not been pleased. It was probably this same impulse that motivated Ailon to want to let more people read the book. The woman of the Jade Pavilion had some connections outside their own workplace, but Yinghua put a stop to that idea. Wait, she said. I don't think we should show it to any other palace women. We have to be careful with it. That's right, they might lose it, added Guiyuan. Yeah, I guess so, Ailon said wistfully. Mao reached for the book. What she was about to suggest might not normally be acceptable, but considering what she thought Jinchi had in mind, she decided it would be all right this time. What if you didn't give them the actual book, she said, but made a copy for them? Ladies lower in the hierarchy might not have the means, but Ailon was an attendant to a high consort and should be able to procure the paper, brush, and other implements necessary to copy a text. And if she didn't want to take the time or spend the money, well, she didn't have to. What? Ailon said, caught completely off guard by Mama's suggestion. I suppose replicating the illustrations would be difficult, but you have lovely handwriting, so I don't think copying the text would be any problem for you. The producers of the book would no doubt have been better pleased if the woman had bought another copy instead, but when that wasn't feasible, something such as this was the only solution. Though it might be asking too much for Ailon to illustrate the book herself, she could provide a perfectly readable copy of the text, which was really all that was necessary. I see, that makes sense. Ailon's eyes began to shine with a new light. Oof, are you really going to do all that work? Yinghua, don't say that, Guiyuan reproved her. Mamo set the book carefully in front of Ailon and resolved to get back to work. Their break time was almost over anyway, so they all needed to hustle, or Hongyang would fall upon them like a lightning bolt. It was all a very roundabout way for Jinchi to get what he wanted, Mamo thought. With books, of whatever kind, circulating more freely in the rear palace, at least a few people would learn to read. Back when Mau Mau had been serving Jinshi directly, she'd had a few opportunities to see some of the paperwork he dealt with in his own work. He'd asked for her opinion on one project, purely out of curiosity, of course. He had wondered how the literacy rate among the women of the rear palace might be improved. Mau Mau was getting first-hand experience of how well Jinshi's plan was working. She was holding a twig in her hand, scratching the characters Xiaolon into the ground. Xiaolon herself watched intently, then tried to copy her. Xiaolon always seemed like she was more interested in snacks than anything else in life. Mau Mau had been surprised when she'd first come up to her and asked her to teach her to read and write. When Mau Mau asked why, Xiaolon said the woman who had been reading stories to her had stopped. The woman's voice had finally given out after being endlessly petitioned by the illiterate palace women to read to them. She was a good-hearted woman, though, and had agreed to make copies of the book if the others would make the effort to learn to read it themselves. So there was someone else out there thinking along the same lines as Eilon. It was an awfully generous offer, considering the price of paper. Mau Mau had suggested that she could read to Xiaolon, but the other woman had shaken her head. "She was nice enough to write it out for me, so I can't cheat like that." Mau Mau mussed Xiaolon's hair fondly. She thought she was giving her a friendly pat, but she mostly succeeded in making it go every which way, earning herself an annoyed look from Xiaolon. Thus, the time they usually devoted to gossiping was turned to learning to write. Xiaolon gripped her twig with a look of intense concentration. The character, Zhao, which consisted of just a few short strokes next to each other, still looked a bit like a pile of dead bugs to her, but it was simple enough and she could manage to recognize it. Lan, however, was a far more complicated character and was giving her a good deal of trouble. Mau Mau wrote the character in the dirt again, nice and large. This time, she broke it down by its 3 radicals to make it easier for Xiaolon to understand. On top, there were 3 simple strokes representing grass. Beneath them, a character that by itself meant gate, and inside the gate was the character for east. Mau Mau started by having Xiaolon practice the pieces individually. "I never knew my name was so hard." Xiaolon received passing marks on her grass radical, barely, but her teacher insisted she redo the gate and east parts. The fact was, Mau Mau wasn't sure what the characters for Xiaolon's name were. Xiaolon's own parents probably hadn't been literate, but she assumed it would be appropriate to use the most common characters for the name. When Mau Mau had been taught to read, she'd started with her own name. It was important, she was told, for helping you know where you came from. But then, she was often told she had all the charm of a stray cat. "If you learn to write the characters, you'll obviously end up learning to read them. But would you rather focus on just reading for now?" Mau Mau asked, but Xiaolon shook her head. "If we're going to take the time, I'd rather learn to write them. That can only help in the long run, right?" That was true. The ability to read and write opened up many more job opportunities. Even in the rear palace, literate women were put to relevant work and treated better than the interchangeable laundry hops. It was even said that the especially accomplished palace woman might find herself reassigned to administrative duties outside the rear palace. "I'll have to find work for myself after I leave here. I'd better learn while I have the chance." So Xiaolon was trying to plan for the future, in her own way. She'd come to the rear palace about the same time as Mau Mau. Terms of service lasted 2 years, so she was already halfway through her contract. Given that she had been sold into service by her parents, it seemed unlikely she could expect to go back home when her time was up. "I see. We may need to make the lessons a little more intense then," Mau Mau said, and then she started writing swiftly in the dust. Yeah, thanks. So, what does this say?" "It says, Dong Zhong Xia Chao, caterpillar fungus." Okay. And this?" "Mantuluo Hua, thorn apple. And this one?" "Gigan, kudzu root." Do these words actually come up a lot?" Mau Mau didn't say anything, just reluctantly rubbed away the vocabulary she'd written and replaced it with more ordinary terms.